r/nosleep. Hosted by you/scarymaxx. The House of Attics and Basements. Part 1. It was a few weeks ago when I realized I was being watched. It started as creaks in the attic, something I blamed on mice, maybe a barn owl. Even one night when I heard two loud thumps from just above my bed, I wrote it off as the house settling, or maybe the mice knocking over some dusty family heirloom. I might have ignored the sounds, but over the next few days, I began to notice additional evidence of an intruder. First, I'm careful about how much I drink, always sure to consume no more than half a bottle of wine in a given night. I always draw a careful line in Sharpie on the label, making sure I don't go over my limit. But a week ago I found a bottle on the kitchen counter, its contents short of the mark. I called both the police, who took a quick report over the phone but neglected to send a squad car, and the local locksmith, who happily changed the locks on all of my doors. I also installed some wireless cameras equipped with motion detectors in several corners of the house. I slept soundly that night, my phone by my bed primed to alert me if the motion detectors tripped. But I woke to find my wine downstairs completely gone. Right away, I reviewed the footage of the night before. At first, nothing seemed to move at all, but as I watched more carefully, I noticed the slightest dance of light and shadow moving through the house. The smear of light descended the attic ladder, and moved slowly through the hall, stopping to examine the family portraits that lined the spiral staircase on the way to the kitchen. From there, it moved to my bookcase, plucked a volume from the shelf, and took it to a nearby chair, where it stayed for several hours leafing slowly through pages. Finally, the smudge moved to the kitchen, drinking directly from the bottle until it was empty. The bottle empty, the smear walked up the stairs and over to my bedroom door, turning the handle ever so gently. Finally, it walked slowly to the foot of my bed. For about 10 minutes, it waited there, watching me sleep. Now, I usually consider myself to be a level-headed type. Once, after a car accident that completely destroyed my vehicle and left the other driver and his entire family dead, the police mistook me for a bystander due to my calm demeanor. Perhaps it was due to some kind of shock, but it's really just my temperament. Things don't faze me. This intruder, though, was different. Like a storm swelling some old knee injury, the smear's visit from the attic stirred an emotion I hadn't felt since my early youth: fear. You see, as a rule, I avoid the attic. As a boy, I spent a few long afternoons up there on rainy Oregon days. A treasure trove of ancient family heirlooms were stashed up there, dating back to pioneer days. Packed in trunks I found ancient, chipped sets of porcelain cups, and a chess set carved of black and white rocks along with a rotting board. Then, as I rooted through dusty crates, moth-eaten carpets, and portraits of long-dead relatives, I came across an old grandfather clock, its hands both pointing at exactly 10 o'clock. Though the hands were stuck in time, a pendulum continued to swing unseen behind the wood, its tick-tock as steady as a sleeper's heartbeat. The clock towered over me, reaching nearly all the way to the attic roof. Its body was built of carefully crafted wood inlay, dark cherry running in tight geometric patterns that curved into themselves, forming tiny fractals, the wood growing so thin in places that it seemed impossible any human carpenter could have built it. Strangest of all, near the base, a metal plate bore strange, runic letters that I couldn't decipher. Below these, followed a list of names, numbers and dates. Robert Brown, 7, December 1, 1692, January 15, 1705. Daniel Brown, 8, January 15, 1705, September 7, 1751. Jedediah Lewis, 4, September 10, 1751, September 12, 1751. Edna Lewis, 9, September 12, 1751, December 25, 1800. John Lewis, 5, December 25, 1800, April 18, 1820. The list continued through the years until it reached familiar names. Franklin Walker, 11, Jan 1, 1930, April 11, 1950. Jane Walker, 5, April 11, 1950, May 16, 1980. Samuel Walker, 10, May 16, 1980. These were my great-grandfather, grandfather, and father. The end dates were those of their deaths. The start dates weren't their births but seemed to be something else, sometimes the death of a spouse, sometimes a parent. The other numbers didn't seem to follow any pattern whatsoever, though notably, my father's number matched that of the clock. I might have spent more time looking at the clock if my father hadn't found me up there. Even though he was almost sober for once, he flew into a rage, picking me up as if I were a straw doll and nearly throwing me down the ladder. When we were back downstairs, he turned to me with wild eyes and told me never to go into the attic again. Through his usual anger, though, I sensed something different. A deep and inexplicable fear. There are things up there, said my father after a few seconds. Things a boy shouldn't see. Probably things a man shouldn't see either, not that any of us have a choice. Your day will come, of course. But you may as well not rush it. No need for you to go finding trouble. The traveler will find you soon enough. He took out his pocket knife and a fresh bottle of scotch, neatly cutting the metal top in one practiced motion. My father was a wizard with that knife, a generations-old family heirloom that he'd inherited from his own father. He loved that knife more than me, sharpening it weekly and polishing its mahogany handle, which featured a small picture of the god Janus inlaid in mother of pearl. My father could peel oranges one-handed and pop the corks out of bottles without looking. He poured a scotch glass almost full and gulped it. "How old are you?" he asked. 12, sir." He handed me the glass, an inch of scotch still sloshing around the bottom. "A man soon enough," he said, as I took my first sip. "But stay out of the attic if you know what's good for you. Basement, too, as long as I mention it. And always sleep with your door locked." He took back the glass from my hand and waved me away. I promised not to return to the attic and kept my word as long as my father lived. The morning after I reviewed the video footage of the smear, I dressed in my oldest jeans and t-shirt, and opened a fresh bottle of scotch for added courage. I took my father's knife from my pocket, trying to remove the top packaging as he once had, but ended up cutting my thumb. He had never bothered to teach me most of his tricks. As usual, I drew a small black line and Sharpie a few fingers beneath the top of the bottle. It had been nearly 30 years since my last trip up to the attic. I realized that I'd been avoiding it as if my father were still around to terrorize me. All the more reason to do this. I took a long drink as I reached the pull cord to the attic. But even with the liquid courage, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father's ghost was lurking over my shoulder. I felt suddenly small again, as if I'd traveled back in time to my boyhood. The cord seemed to lurk just out of reach. I took a running start and grabbed it, pulling the ladder down as cold air poured down from above. I climbed slowly, a flashlight in hand. Its beam illuminated floating cities of dust, great cobweb kingdoms. It seemed like this wasn't my house, but one that belongs to the spiders and rats. As I hoisted myself onto the creaking floorboards, skittering feet and black tails retreated into dark corners and behind dusty sofas. "Hello?" I called out. "Hello?" came the faint echo of my own voice. Around me, dust covered the floor like freshly fallen snow. A line of footsteps led into the darkness beyond. Even before I shined my flashlight at the far wall, I knew where they'd go. My skin bristled at the touch of webs as I made my way toward the ancient clock. I flicked a spider from my chest. How long had it been since I'd been touched by another living thing? Finally, I reached the clock. For the most part, it remained unchanged. Somehow, the invisible pendulum had continued to swing on through the years despite a lack of winding. Brushing a layer of dust from the face, I noticed the first difference. Both hands now pointed at 7, rather than 10. They'd definitely pointed to 10 before. I tapped at the clock face, testing for any sign of looseness, but the hand stayed firmly in place. Then, I looked down at the metal plate at the clock's base. All of the old names were there, stretching back through the centuries, but now I saw an update. Samuel Walker, 10, May 16, 1980, December 21, 2000. Stephen Walker, 7, December 21, 2000. My name had now joined the others, starting from the day my father died. In the hours after my trip to the attic, I broke my usual Sharpie rule and drew a second line, drinking another day's allotment. And then a third. My mind raced. Had my father somehow paid an engraver to make the changes since my last visit to the attic? But then, how had he known the date of his own impending death? No. He had certainly not seen it coming. But what other explanation could there be? Had someone else snuck in and added the changes without me knowing? And if so, why? I walked to my father's study, I still thought of it as his, and pulled a family portrait from the wall to reveal his safe. Inside, I removed his small, black handgun and carefully loaded it. If any answers were out there, it was clear the smear would have them. Tonight, there would be no sleep. Tonight there would be a conversation. The House of Attics and Basements. Part 2. By 7 o'clock that evening, a wave of exhaustion hit me. I set my gun down on the counter and I brewed a pot of coffee, pouring the remainder of the scotch down the sink. Then, as I went to throw the bottle away, I noticed something strange at the bottom of my kitchen trash can. A familiar candy wrapper read red whips in bold, welcoming letters. It had been my father's favorite treat, especially when he was trying to get sober and needed a replacement for the bottle. Two things struck me as odd about the wrapper. First, I'd never eaten licorice in my life. And second, Red Whips had been discontinued almost a decade ago. I fished the wrapper from the trash. Its expiration date read October 30th, 2023. Clearly, this was not some decades-old packaging. Heading to my laptop, I quickly searched for Red Whips discontinued and found a few dozen articles about the demise of the classic candy. According to Wikipedia, Wiley & Sons Company, which produced Red Whips, had been purchased by a competitor in 2012, marking the end of Red Whips as well as several other classic candies. As I started a search for Red Whips re-release, I noticed some strange behavior in my search bar as the computer auto-completed a search for Red Wall Erected. This was something I'd never searched for. Even stranger, when I hit enter, the search returned no meaningful results. Digging into the settings, I pulled a list of previous queries from my machine and found an odd list. President Pence death date. Lollipop 11 songs. San Francisco attack. Anchorage quake. Presidential election 2020. Presidential election 2008. Election 2004. Taiwan defense crisis. The first results were weird. But my hair began to stand on end as the searches got more personal. Stephen Walker. Stephen Walker wife. Stephen Walker College. Representative Stephen Walker. Senator Stephen Walker. Stephen Walker News. Maya Walker. Maya Walker death. Maya Walker murder. Maya Green. Maya Green murder. Maya Green address. My guts twisted as I read these last lines. Maya Green had been my college girlfriend, and the woman I'd thought I'd marry until an ugly breakup just after graduation. As far as I knew, she had married a lawyer a few towns away, then given up her own law career once she started having children. I pulled up Facebook and quickly looked her up, confirming that she was indeed alive and well, as of a few hours ago when she made an Instagram post of herself smiling over a 6-year-old's birthday cake. Still, the search history had spooked me, and I pulled out my phone. Over the years, I'd transferred my contacts info, especially hers, to each new phone. I called up her profile and then hit the call button. Hello? Stephen? It was definitely her voice. Stephen? Is that you? I hung up as quickly as I could. Clearly, whoever had been searching my computer had gotten something wrong. Maya was alive and well, living a happier life than I could have ever provided. Maybe I'd had too much to drink, or maybe it was the stress, but for the first time in years, I felt a pit in my stomach, some kind of cocktail of grief and regret that I hadn't known was still in there. To be honest, it had been a few years since I felt much of anything at all. And along with that feeling came that vicious thirst that had gripped me in my 20s. The buzz had long worn off, replaced with an evening hangover. How could I have been so stupid to pour that bottle of Macallan down the sink? What was left in the cupboard now? As I turned back toward the liquor cabinet, I heard a click and looked back to see my own gun pointed at me. Holding it was a slim girl, no older than 14. She wore loose sweatpants and a shirt with a picture of Ted Cruz reading "Not My President." I couldn't tell why, but she looked oddly familiar. "What were you going to do with this?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Nothing," I said. "Nothing." She laughed at that. "You're probably right. You're an expert at that, aren't you? Doing nothing. Can you put the gun down?" I asked. "It's making me uncomfortable." "Thing is, I feel better with it pointed at you," she said. "And if one of us has to feel uncomfortable, I'm picking you." "What do you want then?" I asked. "Money? I can pay you whatever you want." She laughed again. "It's funny," she said. "In some ways you're so different. In some ways exactly the same." When I didn't respond, she continued. "I need you to drive me somewhere. Think you can do that? Do I have a choice?" "You do. But you're not much of a risk taker, are you, Steve?" "Stephen. You seem to think you know me pretty well." "Better than you know, Steve. Now get the keys. It's time for a road trip." A few minutes later we were on the freeway headed north. She sat in the back seat, gun in hand. "So, do I at least get to know who's kidnapping me?" I asked, trying to keep things light. "Emily." "Oh, that was my mother's name." In the rearview mirror, I watched her roll her eyes. "So where are we going?" I asked after a bit of uncomfortable silence. "To see my mother." My mind was racing now, pieces starting to fall into place. "Maya Green," I said after a few minutes. "You look just like her." I couldn't quite place it before, but... "Just drive," she said, looking out the window, but after a few minutes, she met eyes with me in the mirror and leaned forward. "So do you. She's just some ex-girlfriend, right? She asked. Yeah. Were you ever engaged? No. Almost. What happened? She asked. She was less taunting now, more genuinely curious. She got tired of me, I said after thinking it over for a moment. She said I was wasting my life. Well, she got that right, said Emily. You know, I've been watching you for a few weeks now, and I've got to say, you are genuinely doing nothing with your time on this planet. Like, your biggest accomplishment over the last month is a grocery run, and I'm 99% sure that only happened because you ran out of wine. What's it matter to you? I asked. She shook her head. You're right, she said. Just drive. I looked back at her, and a name my father once told me bubbled up from some dark corner of my mind. The Traveler, I said. Are you the Traveler? At the name, the girl's face went white, and she looked away. Where did you hear that name? She asked, but I didn't respond. No, she said after a while. Of course not. He's sick. Barely human. I could never do the things he does. As I looked back, I saw a tear streak down her face. I might have asked why, but I was interrupted by my car's navigation. You have arrived. We walked to the sidewalk facing Maya Green's house. Her last name wasn't even Green anymore. The house was a classic Victorian, tastefully restored but painted in bland colors. Inside, light bloomed from warm orange bulbs and the sounds of laughter mixed with clanking dishes echoed out through the empty street. A little boy, maybe 6, was watching us through the window, both of his hands pressed up against the glass. Is that your brother? I asked, but Emily shook her head. No, I've never met him. Should we knock? We should get back. She was crying now. I just wanted to know for sure that she's still here. She's fine, I said. Better than fine. For now, said the girl. But it's only a matter of time. He'll come for her. Just like he came for mine. The drive back was quiet. I tried to start a few conversations, but Emily was in no mood. She tapped the gun thoughtfully against the window glass, contemplating her next move. As we got home, I looked up at the house, taking it all in, as if for the first time. I remembered coming back from a trip to the coast as a boy to find it freshly painted, shining white and brilliant in the August sun. That same paint was chipped and peeling now, the whole thing gone to seed. Then, as I cut the headlights, I looked up at the upstairs window and saw him for the first time. Just his eyes, really, staring cold and dead. He turned his head slightly, like a bird assessing a worm. I could tell Emily saw him too because she leapt out the car door. She raised her gun and fired a single shot, shattering the window. For a moment, the Traveler stood there, watching us through the broken glass. Then he took a step back into the darkness and was gone. The House of Attics and Basements. Part 3. Was that him? I asked, but Emily was already running for the house. She sprinted up the front stairs and fumbled for her keys at my front door. They didn't work. Without missing a beat, she took a pocket knife out of her back pocket and began digging at the lock. Get the door, she shouted. Hurry. I jogged over as fast as I could and opened the lock. Inside, the house was quiet. Emily started to head toward the stairs, but I held her arm. Opening my security camera app, I checked for activity all around the house and found none. The attic ladder had been lowered. I followed Emily upstairs and down the hall, right to the spot where the Traveler had been standing. Must have left in a rush, she said bitterly. He was right there. Right there. Shattered glass shimmered like ice at her feet. She looked out into the darkness of the front yard, and the wind from the broken window pushed at her light brown hair. She looked cold, and for a moment, I had the odd urge to hug her, though of course I didn't. There's a chance I can still catch him, she said. I've got to go. She stopped at the base of the attic stairs and tossed me the gun. Might want to sleep with this from now on. I won't be back, but he will. She paused for a moment, and then added. I'm sorry about some of the things I've said before. There are worse things to be than lazy. Back home. She trailed off. Just, stay safe. Lock your door. Maybe, if you're lucky, he won't be interested in you. I realized she was still holding the small pocket knife that she'd tried to use to open the front door. Looking closer, I saw that it was my father's, bearing the distinctive image of Janus. Wait, I said. I can't let you take that. It's mine. She laughed. Check your pocket. When I did, I was surprised to find my father's pocket knife in its usual place. I examined it in the light. Impossible. The knife was custom, not to mention centuries old. It was like seeing two copies of the Mona Lisa, side by side. "Goodbye, Steve," she said. She started up the ladder, and I followed. I wanted to tell her to wait, that I still had questions, but she was already practically out of sight. And even though I wanted to rush after her, I could barely bring myself to go into the attic. I followed her up the ladder, slowly, a rung at a time. "Please," I said as I tried to force myself to keep climbing. "Just one more thing." "Make it quick," she shouted back at me. "How do I see you again?" "Like I said, I'm not coming back." "Please," I said. If you really want answers, they're all in the library." I'd start with John Lewis, 1800. He had a lot of it figured out. Read what he wrote. Or don't. It's up to you. I heard her footsteps above me now, moving in the direction of the clock. "Wait," I tried to add. "With all of those things you were searching for on my computer." I stopped speaking as a faint blue pulse of light flashed through the room. My head had just reached the attic floor, and through the flash, I saw Emily's silhouette fading into nothing, almost as if disintegrating, the tiny pieces of shadow being sucked into the clock's face, which glowed a brilliant blue. Then, suddenly, the light was gone. I turned on my phone's flashlight and fumbled through the darkness toward the clock. Reaching out, I touched the face and found it cold to the touch, like touching the window of a grocery store refrigerator or a window on a winter's night. "Emily?" I asked, but there was no response. She was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The fact of it hit hard. I couldn't quite explain why, but the thought that I'd never see this girl again hurt me in a way I hadn't felt in years. At first, I thought it was just curiosity. Between the knife, the weird web searches, and everything Emily had said, I had 1,000 unanswered questions. But it wasn't just that. Even though I'd barely known her for a few hours, and I'd spent most of those at gunpoint, I couldn't escape the idea that we were somehow linked. Every fiber of my being told me to follow her. But how? I examined every surface of the clock, looking for a way to open it. I tried to find any sort of door or latch, anything that would open the clock so I could look inside, but there was nothing. I knocked on the clock, searching for hollow spaces, but there was no sound. I may as well have been knocking on a solid tree trunk. Over the next few hours, I tried it all. Knocking, kicking, shouting "Open Sesame," and my own name, and my father's and Emily's, but the clock simply continued its tick-tock, its mechanical laugh. I was sweating now, even with the cold night air. I brought up a six-pack to drink and cool down. Then I tried to take the clock apart. I lugged my father's rusting toolkit from the barn and got down to business. I tried to pry open the wood inlay with a screwdriver, but I couldn't even scratch it. It was as if the wood were steel or iron. Ever weirder, the ancient glass of the clock's face was just as strong. I tried screwdrivers, drills, and then a hammer. Finally, I brought a heavy garden shovel and swung it at the clock's face with full force. It, too, bounced off with nary a scratch, as if the glass were a brick wall. Same for the wood base. The shovel ricocheted off it and gave my hand a nasty cut. Clock 1, Stephen 0. Next, I tried to budge the clock from its position against the wall but found it to be completely immovable. No matter how I strained, it remained in place, as if bolted in place with steel rivets. A crowbar made no difference. The things was stick. All the while, the clock continued its incessant ticking and talking, an unseen pendulum swinging even as the second and hour hand remained in place, both pointed directly on the 7. Giving up, I went downstairs to clean and bandage my injured hand. The smell of isopropyl alcohol was intoxicating as I poured it over my wound, and I quickly found myself back in the kitchen, opening a bottle of red. Carefully, I took my Sharpie and drew a line in the usual spot on the wine bottle, committing myself not to fall back into bad habits. In truth, though, it had been a stressful day, and I couldn't be blamed for breaking a minor self-imposed rule. The clock, after all, could wait. I walked to the office and settled into my father's chair, a Bordeaux glass in hand, watching the light catch the red swirls as I helped the wine breathe. Searching the shelves, I found the old, leather-bound family archive I'd seen my father leaf through on occasion and flipped through the years until I got to 1800. My father had been an obsessive, unable to let go of even the smallest problem. Once, when his truck wouldn't start, he had disappeared into the garage overnight, toolbox in hand. He was a farmer without much mechanical experience. But I woke to find him still awake, his truck disassembled all around him, each small part carefully organized according to some complex system known only to him. "Don't touch anything," was all he said. For 3 days, my father practically lived in the garage, leafing through the owner's manual and fiddling with various gears and pistons. On the 4th day, he slept for nearly 24 hours. Then he woke up and got back to work. On the 5th day, the truck was reassembled, and on the 6th day, my father drove it to town, returning with a $200 bottle of scotch. He had taken a rest in the same chair I sat in now. Here, he slowly took down the bottle 2 inches at a time. 12 years old, I had entered his study cautiously and congratulated him. "All I did was not give up," he said. "Try it sometime." He shook his head, drank a bit more and settled deeper into the soft leather of the chair. "French lessons. Guitar. Dancing, for God's sake. I've still got the clarinet you never even opened. Little master. Dilettante. Little master of giving up." It had been a few hours later, long after my father had passed out dead asleep, that I woke to see a stranger watching over me. He sat in the antique rocking chair in the corner of my room, the one where my mother had once held me, even when I was far too old to be babied. He didn't speak at first, but I heard a slow, scratching sound and smelled the distinctive scent of pine. Paralyzed in fear, I didn't move, trying to breathe evenly so he wouldn't realize I'd seen him. As the minutes passed, I saw moonlight catch the wide side of a blade in his right hand and realized he was whittling. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like a small pocket knife. "I had considered," said the man, his voice oddly familiar, "hanging you by your feet, your neck open just so above the collarbone. Up somewhere high. A tree or a roof, so that they found your puddle first. Another option would be skinning you alive." "Please," I said quietly. "Please." "But what would be the point?" He stood now, nearly shaking with anger. "Your death would barely register. Just like your mother's." He paced the room, dragging the knife along the wallpaper, which slowly peeled. "What do you want?" I asked. "That's easy," he said, still pacing. "All you've got to do is keep up the good work. Keep being you." My father claimed he didn't believe me, at least to my face. Over time, even I had come to believe the visit was a nightmare. Now I knew the truth. The traveler had been there all along, waiting for something. Waiting until I had something to lose. The House of Attics and Basements. Part 4. The Diary of John Lewis, April 16, 1820. I can tell the end is close now, and God's truth is that I'd rather the story that follows remain a mystery. But for you, Winston, I feel a father's duty to describe the curse that is about to befall you. Though the words you are about to read may bend the imagination, I beg you, do not take them as the ramblings of a feeble-minded old man, for I assure you they are as truth. Though I took possession of the family home in Virginia upon my mother's passing on Christmas, in the year of our Lord 1800, it was several years before I found the clock. In truth, I suspect, I had spent much of my life trying not to find it, as my mother had made great pains to keep it sealed, paying a premium to a local mason who worked with discretion as he built what might have looked like a chimney to the careless eye. Thus the accursed clock may have well stayed if not for an unwelcome visit from the other side. Indeed, I returned from a buying trip in town to hear an ungodly racket emanating from above. Then, lantern in hand, I ascended into that dusty place and witnessed a most peculiar sight. It was a local boy, Ben Hardy, poking his head through from the wall's far side. Of course, this apparition seemed near impossible, as the wall's other side consisted of nothing, save thin air. "Boy," I shouted, "cease this immediately and state your purpose here," to which he responded that it was I who had hired him to do this very thing. When I assured him he was speaking nonsense, he called me a stingy old bastard, at which point I retreated downstairs to retrieve my musket. By the time I returned, Ben was gone, leaving only the hole in the brick and various debris cluttering my attic. Through the hole in the bricks, I saw the clock for the first time. One could not condemn its craftsmanship, for the marvels of its wood inlay put even the Shakers to shame. With the passing years, I have come to identify this artistry as that of the devil himself. Perhaps a wiser man might have restored the bricks to their original condition, but if I am guilty of any sin, it is the devil's curiosity. Indeed, I took the next few hours, removing the remaining bricks, and examining the clock, whose craftsmanship even exceeded my first assessment. My next thought was to sell the clock, both repeating a financial reward and protecting the house from any witchcraft. In town to meet an antique dealer, I ran into no other than Ben Hardy himself, who I grabbed by the ear and demanded an explanation regarding his recent trespass onto my estate. The boy, eyes wide, so vehemently denied any such intrusion that I was apt to believe him, despite what my eyes had seen. I released him, and he scampered away. Finding a local antiques dealer, I elicited great interest in my discovery, so much so that he immediately accompanied me back to the house. There, he took great interest in the clock, fawning over its fine woodcraft and steady sound, though puzzled by the fact that both hands pointed permanently at 5. We spent the better part of an hour searching for any sort of door or hinge that may unlock the clock's mechanical interior, but found our efforts thwarted. He promised to return, and departed. I might have had him back, except for the dreadful thing that followed. I awoke the night to a considerable thumping from above. Musket ready, I ascended to the attic, ready to fire for the first time since the days of King George. But the weapon proved fully unnecessary. What I found above was already dead. There, on the attic floor, was a large cloth sack, half soaked red and brown with drying blood. Inside was Ben, all cut to pieces and neatly stacked within the bag. Body at the bottom, then limbs, and finally head in a sort of pyramid. I vomited and retreated downstairs, rousing your mother. Our first instinct, of course, was to alert the constable, but she quickly reminded me of my earlier altercation with Ben, and the suspicion that would be cast on me. Without long before dawn, we agreed to cast the sack and all its contents into a recently dug hole, originally intended as a garden bed. I slept not a wink, but found it necessary to return to town on some business in the morning. Imagine my surprise, then, without a wink of sleep, when I came across Ben Hardy at the local pub, half drunk and complaining of my earlier assault to any who would hear. Forgetting my business, I made haste for home, where I dug up the dirt I'd hastily thrown upon Ben's corpse and found the bag very much still full of Ben's dismembered corpse. Then, before I might even make sense of the current situation, I heard a scream escape the house and ran inside to find your mother in hysterics. She pointed up to the attic and begged me to seal the door, for the devil himself had visited us. You, of course, were but a baby of 3 months then, but even you ceased your crying as if aware of the dire matter at hand. Armed with both gun and the pocket knife given to me by my own dear father, I ascended the stairs to the attic and found 2 bags. They contained you and your mother, both cut cleanly into pyramids, like Ben before you. Oh, how I howled in torment at the sight, especially at that of you, so small in your tiny, soaking bag. Then, I descended, to find your mother, your living mother, screaming uncontrollably, holding her firm to her breast. Your mother refused to spend another night in that accursed house. Taking you, she traveled back to Pennsylvania to visit your maternal grandparents at their family estate. As for me, I stayed behind. I brought a chair up to the attic and waited to discover the author of my tragedy. On the 3rd night, I woke from half sleep to see a fresh sack thud to the ground, materializing before the infernal clock. With it, out stepped a man in gray attire, save for a black mask that covered his visage. I reached for my musket, but he was too quick. He crossed the room in seconds, and slashed at my hand with a pocket knife, disarming me. Then, as if reading my mind, he kicked my other hand as I reached for my own knife, sending the weapon skittering across the floor. Inscrutable, he looked down at me, holding my bleeding fingers. "Why have you cursed me, foul spirit?" I demanded. He didn't respond but merely gestured to the bag. Slowly, I crawled to it and pulled at the rope that knotted it closed. The burlap opened to reveal my own corpse. "So you are Death himself then?" I inquired. "I say then, fine. Come do your worst. My soul is pure. Take me to my eternal Lord." But the figure shook its head. "You are not ready yet, 5, said the figure. "You still have too much to lose. But don't worry. I will return." And with that, he turned back to the clock. Reaching it, he stabbed his knife directly into the center of its face. A blue light filled the room, like that of a full moon. Then he was gone. That very night, I burned the whole house to the ground and left for Pennsylvania. As you know, we are settled here now, in the house I built upon my return. What you may not know, is that shortly upon completion of the house, I made an unsettling discovery in the attic. There, resting in the corner as if it had been here all along, was the clock, ticking and talking its regular rhythm. And there it has stayed ever since. Until last night, your wedding night, when I awoke to hear familiar thumps in the attic. The House of Attics and Basements. Part 5. I stood in front of the clock, knife in hand. I had wanted to dismiss John Lewis's diary as some kind of hallucination, but there was just too much I couldn't explain. So much about my encounter with Emily had left me baffled, especially the way she had disappeared into the clock. John Lewis had claimed that the stranger he encountered had used the knife as a sort of key, inserting it into the center of the clock's face. I touched my fingers softly to the cold glass, searching again for hidden ridges, but I came up empty. On the other side, there might be nothing. Or there could be Emily. Or the traveler, waiting in the dark with his own glistening knife. Thinking of him, I started to sweat. Suddenly, it was like I was a boy again, watching him split the wallpaper in my bedroom with his razor-sharp blade. Except in my imagination, it wasn't wallpaper, but my skin, a wall of flesh splitting clean down the center. I held the knife inches away from the glass, preparing to stab forward. For some reason, I felt an instinctual hesitation, the way you might feel before stabbing a living thing. I wondered, briefly, if my father had ever done this. Had he tried to travel through the clock, or had he only suspected that visitors came through it? My father was a success by all accounts. He'd taken a struggling farm and survived a few hard years, buying his neighbors' farms for pennies on the dollar during drought years. Then the rains had come back, and everything seemed to break his way. Every crop he grew seemed to pay off better than expected, and after a few years a big ag company had offered to fold him into their business for an ungodly amount of stock. By the time he died, we were one of the richest families in the county. My father always credited his success to tenacity. He'd been the last man standing. The sole survivor. Of course, around town there were whispers. Too much luck for one man, people would say. Deal with the devil, whispered the old women in church. My father paid them no heed. He was the hero of his own story. Which is why I ended up being such a disappointment to him. The little master, he always called me, bitterly. He'd been right, of course. Even as I got older, I made a habit of giving up. I was a B student in high school and a middling athlete. In college, I changed majors half a dozen times before finally graduating with a trendy self-designed liberal arts degree. My father had declined to attend my graduation. He died shortly after that in an unexpected accident, falling down the house's central stairs, his neck twisting around in an impossible angle. Any momentum I might have had in life seemed to leave me then. Maya had stuck with me for about a year after father's death, seeing me through the grief. But I'm not sure that's even what I'd been feeling. I was simply stopped. What did any of it matter, if my father wasn't there to see? My father was a success, but he was no adventurer. If anything, I was surprised he hadn't had the clock encased in a steel box. Maybe he had his reasons not to. I was no bold hero either, but here I stood, knife in hand. Maybe I just had less to lose. I thought of Emily. Then I stabbed the clock face. The glass gave way beneath the knife blade like jello, parting cleanly as it began to glow bright blue. My body began to tingle. Then everything went black. I found myself in a vaguely familiar room. Small windows lit the otherwise dark space. An ancient furnace, no longer used, sat dormant in the corner. The basement. My basement, or at least, one very much like mine. I looked back at the clock. Everything appeared the same as before, except for one key difference. Here, the hands pointed to 8. Before I could examine the clock further, I heard footsteps from above and heard the door to the main floor open. Light flooded down the stairs, and I quickly hid beneath the furnace. Above me, I watched as Emily started down the stairs. "I told you we're not done talking," came a man's loud voice from behind her. "Just have your assistant take care of it," Emily shouted back. Like when she gave me my period talk. "Now, Emily. Or you'll regret it. I promise you." She turned back upstairs and closed the door behind her, the room going dark again. Slowly, I crept up the dark staircase, listening to the sounds or arguing in the distance. Emily and the man walked in the direction of the front door, practically screaming at each other now. Then they headed outside. A minute later, I heard a car engine turn on. Then, all was silent. Quietly, I opened the door to the main house and peered inside. Here was the kitchen, my kitchen, and yet entirely different. A wall of cabinets had been removed to create a modern open floor plan flowing into the living room, and the oak cabinets had all been painted white, their antique brass knobs replaced with stainless steel. Out in the living room, a garish 80-inch TV was playing CNN at low volume for an audience of no one. Lining the staircase, the ancient portraits were gone, replaced with family photos, one of Emily in elementary school, and another of her posing with Maya Green. And then the one that made my heart stop, Emily, Maya, and me. At least, a version of me. He was maybe 30 pounds heavier, most of it muscle, with the kind of smile only successful people wear. A few more steps up, I found another photo of him, this one wearing a red tie in front of an American flag and a small engraving at the bottom of the frame reading, Senator Stephen Walker of Oregon. In a strange stupor, I walked through the kitchen, looking for something to drink. But the liquor cabinet was full of tea tins, and the only drinks in the fridge were cold-pressed juices. "You're a long way from home," came a voice from behind me. I turned to see a man in a gray suit. He wore dark glasses and a black face mask, obscuring his features, but I knew immediately who he was. I felt suddenly paralyzed, like I'd been caught breaking into my dad's liquor cabinet and was about to catch the beating of a lifetime. "It's funny, you know," he said. I never took you for one to get off the couch, much less to go traveling through clocks. But that's the nice thing about this business, I suppose. The surprises. He gestured to the grand kitchen around us. So what do you think, 7? Some people say one version of hell is when the person you became meets the person you could have been. So here he is, the golden boy, or at least, he thinks so. Senator Stephen Walker. Of course, he's not done yet. Ambitious one, he is. Already got his eyes on the White House. Oh, I hope he makes it. I've always wanted to kill a president. Yes, I think we'll give Senator Walker a little time to ripen, see what he becomes. He took a step toward me, removing a poker from the fireplace. He swung it in lazy circles as he stepped toward me, his features inscrutable behind his mask. But you, 7, I could give you 100 years, and you'd just spin around the drain like a little unflushable. He was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Fast as a cat, he sprang up the stairs toward the attic, leaving the fire poker clattering on the kitchen floor in front of me. Still reeling, I ran to the walk-in pantry, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. Through slats in the door, I peered out into the room. In walked Emily, a woman behind her who I recognized as Maya Green's mother, Layla. Just give him time, Layla was saying. The stresses that man deals with on a daily basis are well beyond. But I could tell Emily wasn't listening. Her eyes fixed on the poker in the center of the kitchen floor. She examined it for a moment, then looked directly at me, as if peering right through the pantry door. I just need some time, Grandma, she said. Actually, there's someone I need to talk to. Why don't you go to your room? We'll catch up soon. As soon as Layla was gone, Emily walked right over and whispered through the slats. I hope you know how stupid you were to come here. We're dead now, both of us. I'm sorry, I said. It's okay, she said, smiling a little now. It was probably going to happen anyway. It's kind of sweet. Other you, has never really taken any interest in me before, so it's kind of a nice change. She reached for the doorknob, and the darkness around me was split with a beam of light as the door opened. You'd better come out of there. We should talk.